There's a Boston Review article that addresses the comparison between transracial identities to transgender identities, and it argues that we should not compare them. What I'm going to do is summarize the article and then give some commentary. The first thing to note about understanding this article is that the authors reject gender essentialism. Essentialism in general may be characterized as the doctrine that objects have essential properties. So there are certain properties that a thing must possess in order to be that thing. Okay, that's what essentialism is. So for gender essentialists, they think that there is some natural trait that makes all women women and all men men. And if you don't have that natural trait, then you're not a woman or a man. So the authors claim that there isn't one biological trait or even a set of biological traits that all and only women or men possess that's given to us by nature. And they support this position by pointing to the fact that there are variations of sexual traits. Like some women don't have ovaries, some can't give birth, etc. And they have similar thoughts about race. They don't think there's a particular biological trait that necessarily determines what race a person is. And they support this claim by pointing to the fact that racial categories have changed over time. So my understanding is that the authors believe gender and race are both social constructions and that they are both malleable because they're social constructions. This is an important claim that they're making. Much of the debate about trans identities is about whether this person really is what they claim to be. That's a metaphysical question. Okay, it's hard to define what metaphysics is, but basically it's the study of what is. It's the study of the fundamental nature of things. So the question, what this person really is a metaphysical one. Just so you know, I'm not going to address this metaphysical debate because I don't do metaphysics. All right, so because the authors reject essentialism, they don't think the right question is to ask whether this person really is what they claim to be. Rather, they think the appropriate question is whether we ought to consider them to be what they claim to be. Should we consider someone to be a woman simply because they self-identify as a woman? Should we consider someone to be black simply because they self-identify as black? So they're switching from a metaphysical question to an almost sociopolitical one. According to the authors, when considering whether to revise rules for gender or race classification, we think that there are important considerations at both the population level and the individual level. While it's important and good to value a person's autonomy and respect their identifications, we also think this good must be weighed against the population level effects of revising our classifications. In cases where revising a classification would have a negative social political impact that outweighs the good of respecting how an individual identifies, we think that the classification should not be revised. And we think that revising the rules of race classification to accommodate transracial identification into blackness is a case like this. The reason why the authors think that transracial identities shouldn't be accommodated is because of the socio-political goal of reparations. They say, we think that race classification should continue to track, as accurately as possible, intergenerationally inherited inequalities. More directly, we need conceptual and linguistic tools for identifying those who are entitled to reparations for racial wrongs. Central to this argument, then, is the observation that in the case of blackness, inequality accumulates intergenerationally. Okay, this is a crucial part of their argument. Reparations are there to address intergenerational inequalities, inequalities that have been passed down, so to speak. Furthermore, according to the authors, gender inequality does not primarily accumulate intergenerationally, if only for the obvious reason that the vast majority of households are multi-gendered. So I'm not entirely sure what they mean by this. What they might be saying is that mothers experience some disadvantages, but fathers experience some advantages, and that most people come from homes with that dynamic, both sons and daughters. So it wouldn't be the case that the mom's disadvantage would just pass on to the daughter. There's some countering force from the dad's advantage. And if there was some disadvantage passed down from the mom, it would also pass down to the son as well. I think that's what they're saying. While parents often are responsible for ingraining patriarchal ideas and rigid gender norms in their children, this is not a passing down of socioeconomic inequality itself, but rather a socialization that perpetuates gender inequality, according to the authors. So this is an empirical claim that they're making. Racial inequality is primarily passed down, but gender inequality is not. To be clear, the authors are not saying that sexism is ahistorical. There's obviously a history of it that affects women today, but the inequality is not primarily passed down. If I'm understanding them correctly, the authors believe that gender inequality is primarily perpetuated by every generation believing in and endorsing sexist ideas, but I'm not entirely sure on that. Moreover, to the extent that gender inequality is intergenerational, both transgender and cisgender women suffer from it, according to the authors. This marks a central difference between transgender inclusive classification in the category woman and transracial inclusive classification in the category Black. While transracial individuals avoid much of the weight of anti-Black oppression and white supremacy, trans women and cis women alike are burdened by the legacy of patriarchy. So this is why the authors think that transgender women and men should be recognized and treated as women and men, respectively, but that persons should not be recognized and treated as Black solely on the basis of self-identification. All right, so that's the summary of the article. Here's my commentary. First, I get the impression that the authors think that reparations should only be used to address the passing down of socioeconomic inequality. So since gender inequality does not primarily get passed down intergenerationally, do they think that women shouldn't get reparations? I'm not sure because they don't argue for reparations for women in the article, but that's something I would like to know. One of the examples of reparations they have in mind is affirmative action. And many countries have gender quotas when it comes to political representation, which is a form of affirmative action. What would the authors say in response to that? Perhaps the point that we'll emphasize is that gender inequality is not primarily intergenerational, and therefore, even if we decided that there were good reasons to implement some reparations for women, it would have to be weighed against the benefits of changing the definition of woman to include trans women. And when we do that utility calculation, the result is still that we should change the definition of woman. Maybe that's what they would say. I don't know. Second, the claim the authors make is that trans women suffer from gender inequality as well. But this claim only seems to be true of trans women who have transitioned. A male-bodied person living as a man and who everyone treats as a man wouldn't suffer from gender inequality even though they self-ID as a woman. Assuming that what makes someone trans is an incongruence between self-ID and gender assigned at birth, it seems that the author's argument wouldn't include all trans women. Third, I don't see why we couldn't make distinctions between people who self-ID as Black and people who are traditionally considered to be Black. We could specify that reparations are only for people who have suffered intergenerational anti-Black injustice. So we could still respect transracial identities without giving them reparations, right? I don't really see a problem with that. And fourth, another question I have is what the authors would say in response to transracial identities that aren't politically important. What if the topic of reparations wasn't even relevant? For instance, what if an Asian person identified as white? Would the authors be against that? What sociopolitical goal would outweigh the respect that we would owe to that person in recognizing their self-ID? I don't know what they would say, but again, I would want to know the answer. All right, I'm going to end it here. I hope you found it interesting, and I'll see you all next time.